Thank you, Amit Tanshu, again for inviting me. And I'm very grateful to Delph for this invite. I must say, I really do treasure the fact that I get to talk to people who are not in the social sciences. And I'm always amazed at the number of questions one gets. Yeah. That having been said, I'm also very delighted that I could listen to Dr. Mumba's incredible talk this morning, and it was a huge tent. And so I was just thinking that my presentation might actually just be a footnote to the broad canvas she has kind of presented. And a footnote, there are many definitions of what a footnote is, but one of the definitions is the thinking behind the thinking. And my effort today really is to provide some sort of insight into what I refer to as the thinking behind the thinking about floods, water. And as you can see, this does look like a rather confusing and perplexing title. At some level, it might indicate what I'm going to talk about, but not necessarily the case. And I'm going to try and explain to you why this title is a bit of a puzzlement. As you would all know, we are in a very interesting moment post 2022. There's ChatGPT, right? It is part of our conversations. And it is really the elephant in the room, whether you like it or not, in any university. And in fact, this picture here is something that I got done by AI Bing image creating. It's for free on the net, yeah. And I wrote put in an elephant and put in a laptop with ChatGPT. And I worked up very many variations, which ended up with the elephant getting dark glasses because I didn't quite know what would be how the eyes of an elephant would look at ChatGPT. To put it mildly, we are now looking at a lot of human-machine interactions, not just human-human interactions. So when we are talking in the classroom today, sometimes we have to make sure that we understand that what we might be saying has a lot to do with what the machine has told us. Yeah, and I put this to a friend of mine who is in Silicon Valley, quite well known for all these startups. And I asked him, how does one measure, I don't want to use the word contamination, but how does one measure the impact of ChatGPT on our conversations, DeepSeek and various other such kinds of AI generated content. Yeah. And so he sent me this. I'm not sure how credible this is, but so in something called Plot Set, they looked at 65,000 articles from 2015. Why 65,000? I guess that's the amount that they could manage. And so in 2016, for example, this is 2022, keep that in mind. That is when ChatGPT, OpenAI comes in. There's about 98.2% human, yeah, and we've got 1.8% artificial intelligence generated stuff. Now, this has changed by October 2025 in the 65,000 that were looked at. And it shows that, there's 53% is AI generated stuff and about 46.5% human. Now, I'm not competent enough to understand how they got those numbers and whether they are really indicative of what is happening. But I do know that many of us do, including me, we do use a lot of ChatGPT. And as the earlier speaker had warned us, this is, besides the fact that there's a problem with human-machine interaction, there's also a problem about its impact on resources. But what is the bottom line in this? There is an aspect about AI which we have to be very clear definitionally. One is that it is a large language model. It's modeled on the way that our brain works. And essentially, it's a mathematical function that runs on algorithms. That's the bottom line. Yeah. Okay. And so what it does is that whatever you input into it, it uses statistics and probabilities to find out through prediction and computation, what's the best word to use? Yeah. So you're actually talking to a mathematical function and trying to get meaning out of that. So what I did was I deliberately sent it my rather vague title. You don't pull no punches, but you don't push the river. Yeah. And I thought, okay, let's see what ChatGPT says. And sure enough, it gave me a good pat on the back, said, excellent choice. The title has real depth and rhythm. It already hints at a powerful conceptual tension, control versus rhythm, policy versus pulse. And then I worked with it for maybe maybe an hour or so or more. And 2,963 words later, it gave me a fantastic conclusion, which is what I could have presented today. And that conclusion is that your counter-imaginary, you don't push the river, proposes a you might not be familiar, Cornelius Castoriadis, very well-known philosopher who, amongst many things, talked about how we have an imagination that can exceed our immediate realities, yeah, to put it in a very crude and rough way. So it says that you could propose a Castoriadis kind of reversal. Instead of control, you talk about attunement. Instead of rational domination, dialogue with natural rhythms. And instead of the fantasy of stability, an ethic of coexistence with flux. What a lovely way to end this, by saying, hey, we don't need to be the enemies of floods. We should learn to live with floods. And I thought, wow, that looks like a very easy kind of, and maybe compelling and persuasive way of talking about what I want to talk about today. Except there was a problem. The title is actually from a song by Van Morrison. I don't know if anyone listens to Van Morrison. It's a different generation. I'm a big fan of Van Morrison. And according to one of his biographers, Johnny Rogan, you don't pull no punches, but you don't push the river, is considered to be one of Morrison's finest music accomplishments. And if you have the time, please do listen to that song. But it's not really about flood control. That song is really... So ChatGPT really got this wrong. The song begins as a love song celebrating a young girl's childhood, and then suddenly goes into a mythological search for the Whedon fleece, which is some sort of, it's a very religious, apparently a religious relic, which you go to look for answers, pretty much like maybe ChatGPT. But so now this left me confused. I was moving along with a possibly great presentation saying we should learn to live with floods, but really ChatGPT did not quite get what I was trying to say. And so, did ChatGPT misunderstand me? Problem number one. Did I outsmart the machine by giving it a kind of a challenge that it was not up to? Did I fail to understand what I really wanted? Another way one could, question myself. Or there's something even more that one should get into. And this is really the heart of what I want to get into. Just maybe the human capacity for questioning, Socratic questioning especially, which ends with something called an aporia. An aporia is really a moment, in the Socratic questioning mode, you keep questioning until both the interlocutors and the questioner reach a point where they achieve what is called a philosophical puzzlement. Intellectual movement by knowing the limits of our knowledge and by reaching a point where you have a very informed sense of doubt. That's the way to move forward intellectually, yeah? Not by having answers, which is radically different from that of an AI prompt. Remember, an AI prompt and a question are two different things. A question can end up with a philosophical puzzlement. An AI prompt can, which is mathematical, mathematical function, can give you an answer. So we actually don't want answers. That's the way I think, as a human way of thinking about many of our dilemmas and puzzles. It's actually being able to ask the good question and the right question. Yeah. And so I kind of ended up adding up this, putting them on two sides. There's the mathematical function on one side, which is prediction through computation. And there's another way of really being human, which is about intellectual movement through philosophical puzzlement. So I want to really put forward this question to you today, that actually, human-machine interactions will be beneficial in many ways, but they don't occupy the entire space of our questions and challenges. Yeah, we will really need human-to-human engagements as well, very critical. And so much of this talk is about bringing the rivers into this kind of way of thinking. Yeah. So let me actually first begin to tell you that just like AI, the question of mathematics and prediction and computation and control is really a movement that is 300-400 years old already. And it really starts off in the first part, in the second part of my talk, which is the problems of control. And historians have actually looked at this big shift that happens in between 1500 and 1700. And there's this lovely book by Carolyn Merchant, which she followed up with another one called Autonomous Nature in 2016. That's not the only two books she's written. But she tells us that between 1500 and 1700, an incredible transformation took place in Europe. A natural, that is organic and enchanted domain of the gods, that is nature, is now viewed, it transforms into being viewed as a mechanical clock, what is called mechanism. Yeah, modern nature that gets produced from this is a nature that was the sum of its parts. It offered regularity. It was operated according to laws and rules, and because it was predictable and certain, nature could be controlled and dominated and was opened for colonial and capitalist exploitation. That is what Carolyn Merchant writes. So let me underline this again. That is, the emergence of a way of being able to transform nature into a mathematical code was central to turning nature into something that was predictable and therefore that could be controlled. Yeah. So when we talk about AI in a strange way, historians have already talked about what a certain kind of mathematical thinking has done to nature. Yeah. And so the metaphor of the mechanical clock really begins to emerge as a way of thinking about nature, right? You think about nature as this kind of mechanical order that could be predicted, and because it could be predicted, it could be controlled. Yeah. So the functioning of the natural world can be analyzed into parts and manipulated by mathematics. And I want to give you a very interesting way of seeing this difference. So if you were to look at Michelangelo's painting called The Deluge, the Flood, this is something that he puts in the Sistine Chapel in 1508. Now, if you look at this picture very carefully, the flood is a theological event. There is God, there is suffering, there is humans paying the price for their actions. And so if you look at this painting, there is, of course, the flood, but it's a larger story fundamentally about the divine, the suffering, sin. And so you don't really associate flood only as a natural event. It's caught up in the trap of human morality. Yeah, but at the same time that Michelangelo was doing the Deluge in 1508, there is also his counterpart Leonardo da Vinci, who's often argued to be much ahead of his time. Yeah, so da Vinci, before he passed away in 1519, the last set of drawings that he did is called the Deluge. It's on floods, and in these drawings, interestingly enough, the deluge is not punishment He's not like Michelangelo about punishment, but he's trying to capture pure physics. And water moves, there's vortices that destroy, and landscapes dissolve. He's trying to, in a very secular way, capture a catastrophe. This is nothing to do with the gods, Galileo. Michael, Leonardo da Vinci. So the sublime power is no longer God's wrath, but nature's dynamics, a study of pure force. All right. Now, the deluge depicts a world without divine mercy or human meaning. That's a message, right? Nature, not that of God, but nature of its own physics, its own dynamic, its own its nature as an uncontrolled and unmediated force. That's what Da Vinci is trying to convey. And if you think about it, modern science really makes sure that nature is disenchanted. And Carolyn Merchant referred to this modern nature as the death of nature, because nature no longer belongs to the God. It's no longer enchanted. It is something that is part of pure physics, yeah, mathematics, prediction, computation. And so, if you look at Da Vinci's these drawings, they're not very easy to see, but there are about nine drawings that he did towards the end of his life, where he's trying to imagine a world, that is pure physics, purely outside the world of God. And there is a sense of mortification. In his paintings, the dissolution of landmass and atmospheric confusion in the deluge, land itself becomes lost in the tumult of water, clouds, and dust. And I'm citing this from a book that's just recently out, 2020, by Leslie Geddes, who actually discusses Leonardo's deluge paintings. I'm sure there are many hundreds of PhDs on the subject, but just to get your attention to the fact that there's this huge moment of transformation in how nature is being imagined. It's no longer a part of a story of humanity or morality or of the gods. It becomes something that's studied as a physical force. And when it's studied as a physical force, it is really mathematics, prediction, and computation. Yeah, and this transformation of the natural world into the questions of prediction and control, a European moment, also drives colonialism. And if you were to go to South Asian history, which is what I study, much of all that we write is really trying to deal with this transformation in how we think about nature. Yeah. So if you were to do a course in South Asian environmental history, there'll be scientific forestry, river control, and a lot on wildlife management and conservation. And much of this very clearly talks about how there is this new understanding of the world of nature that is about having the right ways of understanding how to control it, and often through prediction. Yeah. So, and yes, of course, in order to do that, you come across a kind of an internal crisis itself. Now, for South Asia, this is a quick 101. There are two very remarkable engineering minds that initiate this idea of creating what is called the modern river. And one is somebody called Arthur Cotton and Cotley. They didn't quite get along with each other, but nonetheless, they inaugurated South Asia's radical hydraulic transformation. And rivers were essentially, for them, volumes of water flowing in a channel. The differences of flows were marked by different gradients of the geography, and the amount of water they discharged during seasonal variation. If you see in much of what they've written, rivers could be measured, could be calculated purely as volumes. Yeah, and if you knew how much water was flowing in that river, then you'd know what kind of dams and containment structures you need to build. And so, through universal principles, you got wires and barrages, perennial canals and dams. This is all technologies that are unprecedented for South Asia. And there is a new imagination of the river that now emerges. A river that is to be rendered through control, domination. It should be trained. The stable channels are the average flows. And of course, it generates all its goodies, that is perennial irrigation, navigation, and hydroelectricity. So this is the big moment. But despite all of that, there's this one, and the word to use is insult: the floods. Regular seasonal inundations that would cause havoc, destroy canal systems, destroy barrages. Lot of the cropping seasons would be affected. How do you explain the solidity of science with its ability for domination and control and prediction, and this still occurring floods? An absolute insult for the engineering establishment. So, for a long time, if you were to read what many of these 19th century engineers wrote, and something that seeped into administrative imaginations, is that the flood is an outlier. All right? And the rivers don't normally flood, and they should not be allowed to flood. And so what you get is a interesting moment where, much as they are talking against floods, there is slowly and steadily a counter argument that's emerging. And one of them is a counter argument that emerges in around 1867. That's the oldest letter I found, where the British are telling, British administration are saying, we're building all these structures. People are complaining that they're losing access to fish. Can you just find out what exactly is happening? And so they asked somebody called Francis Day, who is the Inspector General of Fisheries, to go and figure out, is modern irrigation, are our efforts to control these rivers actually killing fish? A very difficult scenario. And so Francis Day does a strange thing. He starts to go and check out all the fisheries in the eastern segment. And then he decides to reinvent his understanding of the river. He says, okay, I'm not going to look at rivers as how much water is flowing into it for irrigation. I'm going to ask a different set of questions. How is it for breeding fish? What does it mean for fish migration? What about connectivity to other rivers? And what about these things called floods? And then he really finds out at the end of his long report, he says that during the rains, that is from July to September, the monsoons in India, a great part of the country, that is Bihar and Bengal, is underwater and may not be inappropriately regarded as one vast inland fishery. Even the rice fields attract swarms of fry and small fish. What he finds stunning, actually, he says that this thing about floods, he says, actually there isn't much of a difference between land and water at a certain time. For 5 months in a year, there is no land and there's no water. It's an inland fishery. All right? So the Great Indian Monsoon dramatically connects streams, channels, tanks, ponds, and rice fields into a single sprawling liquid lattice. There is no longer any distinction between land and water. So, if there's no distinction between land and water, what do you make of this thing called floods? What are these engineers banging about that there's something called a flood? And so we have a tension. The unresolved tension between the physical river of volumes and the biological pulse of life, which has haunted South Asia for almost 150 years. The engineering doesn't seem to be able to explain that for 5 months in a year, this is not a land-water divide, right? It's an inland fishery. And so we end up really with a defining moment that only happened in 2005. There's this tension between an engineering vision and, for lack of another word, a biological sense of what the river is as a habitat for fish. And in 2005, there's a massive flood in the city of Mumbai. Yeah? And this is unprecedented, something like 944.2 millimeter rainfall in 24 hours. And the city was unprepared for this. and 943 deaths. And we find repeatedly in South Asia, again and again, we are having these huge floods. And so now even the belief that prediction is possible is going away. Yeah, you cannot predict these events. They are humongous, right? And so Pakistan is affected, South Asia, India is also affected, right? So what does control and prediction and floods now got to do with this loss of prediction? Yeah. And so I snapped this somewhere in London, yeah, and I thought it just best qualified. It says what it says. Sometimes it's all right not to be all right. It's somebody signed by Ollie. And so we have this very interesting moment now in the social sciences where much of the standard business as usual understanding of engineering and even the social sciences has begun to collapse with the impossibility of prediction anymore. Yeah, and I'm going to flag three incredible writings, in my opinion, who are now inaugurating this what is called a perspectival shift, and by Dilip Dakuna and his partner Anuradha Mathur and Dilip Dakuna Sok, 2009. One is 2019, and by V. Chitra, 2025, very recent book. Now, here's how they are offering another imagination altogether. Yeah, and how does that sound? Yeah, so Sok really happens in 2009, which is an exhibition, and it's an attempt to come to grips with what happened in 2005 in Mumbai city after the flood. And both of them are designers and architects, yeah, and they try to suggest that actually this kind of engineering vision of geography, landscape, prediction, that actually doesn't really help us understand the new realities that are emerging. Not that they understood those realities even earlier. So what do they say? They say, until recently, Mumbai was accustomed to being soaked by the monsoons. The rains of July 26, 2005, however, did not soak the city. They flooded it. The need for a new visualization. And so soak to flood is a profound shift. It makes an enemy of a friend, even if it is a friend who is not always welcome. So they want us to basically rethink the idea of the flood in South Asia. And one of the things they do is they say, okay, there you go. So they go back in time and they say, actually this city of Mumbai historically was not this kind of complete real estate that we now look at it. Yeah, it was actually a collection of 7 islands. It was an archipelago, but through 150 years of dredging, draining, and various kinds of ways of filling up this archipelago, you actually got a city. And so they say that actually what we have to understand is that the British saw the monsoon as a foul weather season, an interference to trade and commerce, an impediment to the critical functions of governance, such as surveying land and maintaining infrastructure, and really a spoiler of sorts. Yeah, the cultivation of an attitude to terrain grounded in the belief that water and land are separable. Again, I'm flagging that. This belief that water and land are separable, a spirit predisposed to privileging land over water, firmly held property lines over open terrains, defined land uses over fluid occupancies. What they ended up saying is that actually Mumbai is actually a meeting ground of land and sea, a meeting of two movements. And they talk about that actually Mumbai actually is about, because it's an estuary in the monsoon, it's about actually how it used to invite the sea into its terrain. But by dredging and draining and separating land and turning into real estate, they've ended up trying to keep the sea out. All right. So soak is, and the alternative offer that they suggest is that we have to figure out a way of getting the sea back into the rhythm of Mumbai city itself. Yeah, and so Soak is about making peace with the sea, about designing with the monsoon in an estuary. So they want to change that imagination entirely and totally. This was followed up by another book called The Invention of Rivers, and this is even more interesting. So de Cunha then is arguing now that we have to really think, and mind you, the invention of the river, as if the river doesn't exist. So he says that water is always in transition. If you think about it, it is between states, solid, liquid, and vapor. So when is a river a river, right? There are different seasons. Sometimes it's with water, sometimes without water. And so he says the river, in other words, is but an instant in the enormous rhythmic movements of the hydrological cycle, a mere churn within the atmospheric ocean. I just want to underline this, as Dr. Mumba had said earlier, when you say wetlands, we imagine wetlands in some ways as being static. But actually, if you put the idea of the wetland within seasons and within variations, there is always going to be change. Yeah. So when you use the wetland as a static term, that's a term that you can use for a mathematical function. But when you use it as a dynamic term, in a dynamic way, that is when it's biological, right? And so he's suggesting that actually, if you look at India, that entire country, he says India is but a moment in the rain. That if you were to look at the monsoons, pre-monsoon, monsoon, and after monsoon, we can't look at that entire geography as static. Parts of it are going to be underwater. They are going to be an inland fishery. And it's going to be dry at some points of the year, right? So now you're getting a sense, a biological sensibility. It's not a sense of a stable, static, physical quantity, but actually something that is, part of repeated dynamic variability. So he draws from a myth called the Descent of the Ganga. Now, historically, this myth, historically, insofar as how this myth has been discussed, is about the goddess Ganga dropping from the heavens, sky river, onto the locks of Shiva, who actually takes on that force and then releases it as the Ganga river. Yeah, and so he says that if you take this myth, you can essentially try and understand that India is a moment in the rain, that there's no way of thinking about India without the ferocity of the monsoons and without the fact that land and water are perpetually mixing. It's not a stable given geography. Yeah, and so he then suggests that it is not, South Asia cannot be meaningfully grasped only as a subcontinent that is crisscrossed by rivers. Rather, he talks about something, and this I drew from AI. He says that we have to understand it as a collection, a network of high grounds, a kind of foothold in a Sindhu or an open horizon in the ocean of rain. So if you were to look at the second map, yeah, so he says that it's not a stable, static landscape, but actually about islands or footholds or high grounds in a kind of ocean of rain. And that's a better way to understand the subcontinent. And that's because there's the atmospheric ocean of rain that we have to come to grips with. All right, so a network of high ground, the foothold, the Janapada, anchored in the ocean of rain. Again and again, I think what I'm trying to underline here is that this biological turn is to argue that that land cannot be understood and grasped as a stable quantity. Yeah, that especially given South Asia and the monsoon, it is constantly shifting and changing and transforming through different kinds of seasons and through different kinds of moments, right? And similarly, Chitra in her book, and she discusses this flood of 2005 very cleanly. And she says that look at how that flood was presented by the engineering fraternity and the administration. They said, oh, we really got flooded because there was, it fell on a garbage choked drainage system. There was a failure to predict, as if prediction is still possible, and a failure to interpret and communicate weather data. So, really technical and administrative reasons why so many people died, right? But as she studies it carefully, she says that actually there is no understanding that Mumbai city is actually a estuary in a monsoon. That part, this dynamism, is not grasped. It is still being seen as something static. And so what is the administration trying to do? They are trying to get it to drain faster. When she says, actually, it's not the draining of the city that really is our big challenge. What you have to understand is how the estuary and the monsoon actually breed a very complex set of possibilities with creeks and estuaries, fishing communities, and it is actually a biologically very rich landscape. And the whole idea is not to just jet the water out, but to see how to transform this into a living possibility. The rains, the floods, the creeks, the rivers, the estuary. Yeah. So the Methi, that is the Methi River, which is being turned into a drain, could no longer be a part of the meandering complex system with creeks, wetlands, and estuaries. So what Chitra is actually arguing is that now that we've lost prediction and you're going to get these floods, jettisoning them out quickly is actually not a solution as much as it's going to. She talks about how that kind of attitude has meant the displacement. I'll just read this. By categorizing the Methi as a river and focusing on volumetric logic of capacities, the state, along with developers and higher income developers, displaced informal settlements, reclaimed marshes, destroyed expansive mangrove systems, and captured land for real estate developers. So, of course, the solution is worse than the problem. So, what you want instead is to treat, rather than treating flows as a physical force, an abstract of engineering, rather you treat it as a moment of biological complexity. Get the river to be a living river, to speak to many of its equations with creeks, marshes, etc., etc. And another change, James Scott, before he passed away, his last book, there is a very interesting aspect to this. He says, we insist on treating the river as an assemblage of life forms. This is his assertion. From ephemeral insects to waterfowl, mussels, fish, floodplain species of plants, fish, the long-lived dolphins, and channel catfish, biotically speaking, a river in its entirety, tributaries, wetlands, floodplains, backwaters, eddies, periodic marshlands represent veritable corridors of life forms. James Scott, in effect, is trying to argue that rivers are not a physical force or just simply volumes between a channel, but rather must be seen as something as a biological life force that speaks to an assemblage of different kinds and forms of life. So what I want to actually end up doing is trying to highlight how there's a shift within the social sciences and the humanities towards now arguing that we have to see rivers not as something that is subject to control, domination, prediction, in which then, of course, floods become an outlier. But increasingly, the focus is on restoring the centrality of wetland ecologies, marshes, mires, estuaries, mudflats, mangroves, lagoons, and bogs as biological forces that build on uncertainty, contingency, non-linearity, emergence, and even self-organization. I'll work that through in some of the question answers. But what we are increasingly seeing, in other words, is that is a biological sensibility really is beginning to now take over a much more a mindset that's been dominated by physics and prediction. So, if I was to kind of wrap this up, what has AI got to do with Van Morrison and the death of nature and Leonardo da Vinci, British colonialism, the making of the modern river in South Asia, and the loss of our ability to predict extreme flooding events in a climate altered world? Yeah, how is all this coming together? And that, I would say, really is very much driven by my own reading of somebody called Henry Bergson. In case he's not, Bergson was one of the most famous philosophers of his time. He caused the first traffic jam in New York City was because so many people wanted to attend his talk in 1917. He was, and I will just explain briefly. He was someone who had, such an incredible influence that he also impacted the giving of the Nobel Prize to Einstein by actually. Einstein could not get the Nobel Prize for his writings on specific relativity and general relativity because of Henry Bergson. A very famous debate in 1922, which I can touch on before I end this talk. But Bergson's main point was that mechanical explanations, in essence, is to regard the future and the past as calculable functions of the present. What he ends up saying is that a physiochemical reading of reality will not capture all the complexity that the world presents to us. And he talks about biological life as this explosive force that would actually be subject to creativity, novelty, and improvisation. And so he is in some ways arguing that we should have to move beyond this very limited sense of a physical world that is calculable through a mathematical function, and predictive, and rather look at biology as this field which can capture relations, complexities, contingency, chance, and surprise. And so I would say that the flood pulse actually now announces this big biological turn, which must factor in a qualitatively vibrant biological complexity that is unraveled through contingencies, surprises, and possibilities. So we get beyond the limitations of simply trying to look at the natural world as something that we can mathematically chart, predict, and therefore control, but rather to see it as a way of, creating possibilities for different kinds of life forms and living. Okay, and so let me just end this by saying that we have to decide whether seeing a river as a mathematical function is more viable in this time, or rather embracing this pulse as a moment of biological tension involving creativity, novelty, improvisation, and surprise. Okay, I should end at that. I'm sorry, I might have swallowed many of my own arguments because I was not very confident of conveying all that complexity. But I'm open to the questions. Thank you. And just last, this is the book that I would recommend people having, very beautifully written by Jemima Canals, 2015, and this famous dialogue between. There wasn't much of a dialogue between Einstein and Bergson. Bergson is the man with the beard in the audience, and where they had this showdown in Paris in 1922, with Bergson telling Einstein that he got his notion of time completely wrong. Not completely wrong, but that it was a very spatial notion of time, and Einstein replying in his very bad French that there is no such thing as a philosophical notion of time. All right, thank you.